Dear FFPC, what can we say about racism? In the midst of COVID-19 and shelter-in-place rules and the economic impacts, our nation has had the opportunity to reflect on racial injustice, prejudice, and instances of police brutality that occurs in all corners of our country. The tragic video of the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis has resonated across the globe, allowing many kinds of injustice and inequality to come to light. We are living in times ripe with potential as our national conscience is turning to issues of injustice. It feels like we are more capable than we have ever been to listen to the anger, frustration, and grief, especially from people of African heritage. In the past few weeks, I have struggled as to what I should say as a Christian and as a pastor about what we have seen in the news. However, the biggest thing I struggle with is saying something about racism as a white male who has never truly experienced any real deprivation. I certainly have my own pain, but by far I am deeply convicted that as a white male, my role is to listen, seeking to understand the frustration and pain of people of color in the United States, and to speak sparingly. Some things do need to be said, however, and so I speak as a white person to a white congregation. Social sins, like racism, flourish in silence. I would urge you, as a congregation of FFPC, to listen as well as you can to the pain of injustice that people of color are expressing so clearly right now. After we listen, we must then reflect on what things need to be said. First, racism is wrong, unethical, and evil. There is no version of racism that can be defended through scripture or theology without it severely distorting the gospel in such a way as to render our faith useless and dead. Racism has a corrosive effect on our faith. If the gospel isn't for everyone, how can you be sure that it is for you? The question then is, if we can adamantly say that racism is wrong, how is it that we are still struggling as a nation and as individuals with racism? How is it that we have not recovered from the trauma of institutionalized slavery, reconciled as free citizens, and moved forward in equity? It is a national tragedy that we have experienced hopeful moments in our collective history that offer the hope of resolution, only to find ourselves at the same hateful roadblocks time and again. The abolitionist movements before the Civil War, Reconstruction efforts after the Civil War, even the civil rights movements of the 50s and 60s, all have moved us forward as a nation. And yet we come face to face with horrifying evidence that our core problems are not being addressed. What is the real problem? Well, I speak as a white person to a white congregation, and there are many other worthwhile voices to listen to, and I hope you do. I hope the following ideas help. Naomi Wachira is a modern folk musician born in Kenya and now living in Seattle. A lyric to one of her songs entitled "I Believe" is profound to me. In the song, Naomi shares that she has believed lies about herself, which have become chains that need to be thrown off. These chains are all encapsulated in whether she deserves beauty, to have beauty in her life, to be called beautiful, and to create beautiful things. The most profound part of the song, I think, is this: I can't wrap my brain around why I keep falling for lesser stories. As a nation, and certainly as white people, we consistently fall for lesser stories that are told about people of color and different economic status. We tell these stories about who belongs where and who deserves what. We tell stories about what we are capable of and what could or should never happen. We tell stories about what we might lose if others gain. These are all lesser stories. When we try to justify brutality toward people of color perpetrated by police or other people of color or anyone, we are telling ourselves lesser stories of who we are. We're dividing the world between us and them and denying individuals and ethnic groups an identity as people who have been made in the image of God. If we insist on telling lesser stories about the racial realities of our national experience, we engage in the corrosive nature of racism by denying the capacity of people of color to deserve and create beauty that God has granted all people by the virtue of making them. Now, we do this when we, as white people, assume intention or character traits of people based on their ethnicity. We do this when our imaginations excuse racist behavior as an isolated incident. We do this when we assign blame to victims of racial violence because of their clothing, their bearing, their stature, their fears, or their past. We tell brief and unconnected stories that cannot be woven into a greater story because they are too thin and trite to hold together. What we need is a greater story. We need a story that speaks of the capacity of all people to join God in the creative acts of making the world a better place. We need a story that tells of the potential of all of us to glorify God through our voices, our activities, our cultures, and the color of our skins. We need a story that is so much greater, so beautiful and lovely that we can't help not speak of it. We need a story about each other that we are constantly proclaiming, and in doing so, we stomp out any weed of racism or prejudice as quick as it starts to sprout in our hearts. We need to remind ourselves constantly that God loved the world so much that he gave his only begotten Son, so that instead of death, we might hope in life, and that we might know a God who does not come to condemn us, but to rescue us. And this greater story is the story of Jesus. Isaiah 11 speaks of this story. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots a branch will bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord will rest on him. The Spirit of wisdom and of understanding. The Spirit of counsel and of might. The Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And he will delight in the fear of the Lord. He will not judge by what he sees with his eyes, or decide by what he hears with his ears, but with righteousness he will judge the needy. With justice he will give decisions for the poor of the earth. He will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth. With the breath of his lips he will slay the wicked. Righteousness will be his belt, and faithfulness the sash around his waist. And the wolf will live with the lamb. The leopard will lie down with the goat. The calf and the lion and the yearling together, and a little child will lead them. The cow will feed with the bear. Their young will lie down together. The lion will eat straw like the ox. The infant will play near the cobra's den, and the young child will put its hand into the viper's nest. They will neither harm nor destroy on all my holy mountain, for the earth will be filled with the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. In that day, the root of Jesse will stand as a banner for all peoples. The nations will rally to him, and his resting place will be glorious. Dear FFPC, this is a story big enough to carry all of us into God's future. It is a story that doesn't get old and reminds us of what we need to fight for in our communities and sustain in our hearts. Let us tell the greater story of Jesus that outshines all other stories. Let us tell a story that constantly reminds us of the evil of excluding those of other races from the goodness of the gospel. Let us tell a story in which all people are made in the image of God and worthy of dignity and honor. It is God's story that God tells to us, that we should tell our children and proclaim to a world hungry for a better story. It is also a story we need to tell ourselves every time we watch the news, read the newspaper, or meet a stranger. Thanks for listening.